Only qualified personnel who are familiar with the appropriate national code or local codes, practices, and standards should install, repair, maintain, or adjust electrical motors and their accessories. Personnel operating the motor should use all the necessary personal protection means, as indicated by the laws and regulations of their country. For a proper understanding, it is necessary to carefully read the Motor Use and Maintenance Instruction Manual, available for download from the MGM website www.mgmrestop.com or www.mgmelectricmotors.com, as well as watching the following video. Maintenance operations must be performed by qualified personnel after having disconnected the motor or the machine from the electrical supply, including any possible motor auxiliary supplies with special reference to the anti-condensation heaters. The brake might become ineffective during the maintenance operations. Throughout the maintenance procedures, ensure that no load is applied to the motor drive shaft. Avoid contact with the brake motor frame, as the temperature under normal operating conditions might exceed 50 degrees centigrade. Make sure that the motor has cooled down before proceeding with any operation. Do not use repaired or altered motor components. Only new OEM components can be used as replacement parts. Installation and maintenance personnel must immediately notify their superior of any product defects or anomalies found. The installation and maintenance personnel must not allow any motor operation until all possible problems are solved and when it is safe to operate the motor. BA Series Air Gap Adjustment Instructions. Air Gap Adjustment Procedure. Loosen and remove the brake cover rear nut. Remove the brake cover. Remove all accumulated brake lining material dust with the vacuum. The air gap is the distance between the brake coil and the brake moving element. The air gap must always stay within the values indicated in the tables found in the BA Series user manual. Loosen but don't remove the nuts and the lock nuts from all the brake adjuster studs, so that the brake coil can slightly slide up and down on the studs. Make sure that the nuts are not holding the brake coil and that the brake coil presses against the moving element. Before adjusting the air gap, make sure that all the brake coil lock nuts are loosened. Insert a feeler gauge with a thickness corresponding to the lower value of the air gap allowed range, as shown in the BA Series user manual, between the brake coil and the moving element next to the brake adjuster. Tighten the nut and the lock nut until the feeler gauge is slightly pinched, but not stuck between the two surfaces. To check that the air gap doesn't exceed the allowed range, use a feeler gauge 0.15 millimeters thicker than the one used at the previous step. On a properly set air gap, the slightly larger feeler gauge shouldn't be able to enter the air gap. Perform the same operation at the other two adjuster studs, located 120 degrees from each other. Don't insert the feeler gauge in the gap generated between the two magnetic core faces of the brake coil. In fact, the feeler gauge must be inserted right under the magnetic core face. If the brake is equipped with 6 brake adjuster studs, the air gap has to be initially adjusted only on a subset of 3 adjuster studs, located at 120 degrees from each other. Only once this operation is completed on the first subset of adjusters, proceed in operating the air gap adjuster nuts of the 3 remaining studs, in order to have the nuts slightly pressing against the brake coil. Finally, secure the brake coil by tightening all the top lock nuts. For the final tightening, it's always recommended to first operate the underneath brake adjuster nut, then the top lock nut. Checking the air gap. If the air gap is properly adjusted, a feeler gauge with a thickness corresponding to the lower value of the allowed range will easily enter the air gap, Now, use a feeler gauge 0.1–0.15 millimeters thicker than the one previously used, and make sure that it doesn't enter the air gap. It is important to check the air gap in 3 different spots, 120 degrees apart next to the brake adjusters. The air gap must be even all around the brake coil. If necessary, perform the previous steps multiple times in order to properly set the air gap. Once the air gap adjustment is completed, make sure that all the nuts are tightened on each brake adjuster. If one of the nuts wasn't properly tightened during the process, it's necessary to check the air gap again. Slide the brake cover back into its position, making sure that the brake coil cables and connectors are properly positioned under the brake cover, between the brake coil and the moving element, in order not to have them dragging against the brake disc or on the brake flywheel. Insert and tighten the brake cover rear hex nut. Make sure that the brake disc is free to rotate without any scraping noise when powering the motor and the brake. When powering the brake coil should attract the brake moving element with a quick stroke and hold it without any vibration or noise. In case of vibration, check the following. The terminals are properly connected. The air gap is even and properly set. There are no foreign elements including dust on the brake. Brake springs are properly compressed. The brake is powered with the right voltage.